The word again shouldn't be painful. It's a simple word, neutral, almost hopeful in its implications. Try again, start again, love again. But when Mayte said it across a table in a dimly lit Italian restaurant in November 1997, the word landed like a physical blow. Prince's whole body reacted, his hands gripping the edge of the table, his jaw clenching behind the sunglasses he wore, even in the dark. Again? She wanted to try again, wanted to hope again, wanted to open herself up to the possibility that had already destroyed them once. And he couldn't. Not wouldn't. Couldn't. The difference between those two words contains the entire tragedy of what happened between them. The reason why a love story that should have been epic ended instead in silence and distance, and a grief so heavy it crushed everything underneath it. That conversation in the restaurant, overheard in fragments by a stranger who happened to be sitting close enough to catch the rising desperation in their voices, reveals something that neither Prince nor Mayte could admit publicly for years. They didn't survive their son's death because they were fundamentally incompatible in how they processed loss. Mayte needed to move forward, to try again, to refuse to let tragedy define her future. Prince needed to stop time, to deny what had happened, to protect himself from ever feeling that kind of pain again. And somewhere between those two survival strategies, their marriage became collateral damage, something beautiful that couldn't withstand the pressure of two people trying to heal in opposite directions. If you want to discover the hidden moments that explain why music's greatest love stories ended, subscribe now and join us as we uncover the truth behind the headlines. November 1997, Minneapolis. A small Italian restaurant downtown, the kind of place where celebrities could have private conversations without being disturbed. Prince and Mayte had been coming here for almost 2 years, always calling an hour ahead, always requesting the same corner booth in the back, always arriving through the kitchen entrance to avoid being seen by other diners. Marco had served them dozens of times, and he'd watched their relationship evolve through those meals, seen the way they'd changed from a couple completely wrapped up in each other to two people who seemed to be sitting at the same table while existing in completely different worlds. On this particular November evening, Marco knew something was wrong the moment they walked through the kitchen door. Mayte's eyes were red and swollen, her makeup barely concealing the evidence that she'd been crying recently, probably in the car on the way over. Prince's jaw was set in that particular way Marco had learned to recognize, the physical manifestation of someone trying very hard to maintain control over emotions that wanted to break free. They moved to their booth without speaking, sliding into opposite sides of the table with the careful movements of people trying very hard not to touch each other, as if physical contact might shatter whatever fragile peace they were desperately trying to maintain. The restaurant was quiet that night. 2 booths away sat a couple, completely unaware of who was sitting in the corner. For the first 20 minutes, everything at Prince and Mayte's table seemed normal, or at least as normal as anything could be for 2 people whose marriage was slowly disintegrating under the weight of a grief neither of them knew how to process. They ordered food, made polite conversation, maintained the careful facade of a couple having a quiet dinner together. But facades are exhausting to maintain. And eventually, inevitably, the cracks started to show. It started with a simple question, innocuous on its surface, but loaded with implications that had been building for over a year. Mayte asked Prince if he'd thought about what the doctor had said during their last appointment, about whether they should consider trying again, about moving forward instead of staying frozen in the moment when everything had fallen apart. The question hung in the air between them, heavy and dangerous. And for a long moment, Prince didn't respond at all, just sat there with his hands flat on the table. His jaw working behind the sunglasses he refused to remove even in the dim lighting of the restaurant. When he finally spoke, his voice was low, controlled, the tone of someone who was working very hard to keep from shouting. They'd talked about this. They'd agreed. It was too soon. Maybe it would always be too soon. He couldn't go through that again. Wouldn't go through that again. And with those words, whatever fragile peace had existed between them shattered completely. Mayte's response came fast and sharp. She was 23 years old. She had her whole life ahead of her. She wanted a family, wanted children, wanted to try again instead of staying frozen in grief that seemed to have no end. And she needed to know if Prince could give her that. If he could move past the fear and the denial and the desperate need to control everything. Or if she was going to spend the rest of her life waiting for him to heal in ways he might never be capable of healing. 2 booths away, Lisa's hand froze halfway to her wine glass, her attention suddenly pulled away from her date and toward the conversation happening in the corner booth. She still didn't know who these people were, didn't recognize the famous voice that was now speaking in tones of barely controlled desperation. But she knew she was hearing something private, intimate, the kind of pain that most people only experience behind closed doors. Prince's response came in fragments, his voice tight with emotion that he was clearly struggling to contain. He'd already lost 1 child, already buried 1 son, already stood in a hospital room and watched everything he'd hoped for die in 7 days. He couldn't do it again. Not couldn't. Physically, emotionally, psychologically, couldn't. Every time he thought about trying again, about opening himself up to that possibility, his body reacted like he was standing on the edge of a cliff. Every instinct screaming at him to step back, to protect himself, to never again put himself in a position where fate could take something that precious away from him. The conversation escalated, not in volume but in intensity. The words coming faster, sharper, weighted with over a year of unspoken resentment and incompatible needs. Mayte said something about denial, about how Prince was pretending their son had never died, telling the world that boy Gregory was alive and well when everyone knew the truth. When the death certificate was a matter of public record, when his refusal to acknowledge reality was making it impossible for either of them to grieve in any healthy way. Prince's response was immediate and cutting, his voice dropping to a whisper that somehow carried more weight than shouting ever could. He didn't need to justify how he processed grief. Didn't need to perform mourning for the public or for her or for anyone else. His pain was his own, and if the only way he could survive it was by refusing to speak it out loud, by maintaining a public fiction that protected him from having to relive the worst moment of his life every time some journalist asked him about fatherhood, then that was his right, his choice, his survival mechanism. But Mayte needed something different. She needed to talk about boy Gregory, needed to say his name out loud, needed to acknowledge what had happened instead of pretending it was all some bad dream that could be wished away through silence and denial. She'd just given birth 13 months ago. Her body still remembered. Her arms still felt empty. Her mind still replayed those 7 days on an endless loop. The hope and fear and desperate prayers that had ultimately meant nothing because sometimes biology doesn't care about love or hope or how much you want something. She needed to grieve openly, to cry without being told she was being too emotional, to process her loss in ways that Prince seemed incapable of allowing, either for himself or for her. And in that fundamental incompatibility, in that unbridgeable gap between 2 different survival strategies, their marriage was dying as surely as their son had died, just more slowly, more painfully, in ways that would leave scars neither of them would ever fully heal from. Lisa, sitting 2 booths away, had stopped even pretending to pay attention to her date, her focus completely captured by the conversation happening in the corner. She still didn't know who these people were, but she understood she was witnessing something that would stay with her for years. A window into the private devastation of two people trying desperately to save something that might already be beyond saving. What happened next? In the 45 minutes that followed that initial exchange was a conversation that explained everything about why Prince and Mayte's marriage ended not with betrayal or scandal, but with silence and incompatible grief. Mayte laid out exactly what she needed. Therapy, conversations about boy Gregory, acknowledgement of what had happened, and most importantly, the possibility of trying again, of refusing to let one tragedy close the door on the family she dreamed of having since she was 16 years old, watching Prince on MTV. She was willing to wait, she said, her voice breaking slightly as she spoke. Willing to give him time to process, to heal, to work through whatever he needed to work through. But she needed to know there was a future, needed to believe that they were moving towards something instead of just existing in this frozen moment of perpetual grief. She needed hope. Without it, she didn't know how to keep going, didn't know how to stay in a marriage where the futures seemed to have died along with their son. Prince's response, when it finally came, was the most honest he'd been with her in months, possibly since boy Gregory's death. He couldn't give her what she wanted, not because he didn't love her, not because he didn't understand her needs, but because the fear was too overwhelming, too all-consuming. Every time he thought about trying again, about Mayte being pregnant, about sitting in another hospital room waiting to see if this time fate would be kinder, his entire body shut down. Panic attacks that left him unable to breathe. Nightmares where he relived those 7 days over and over, watching his son die in infinite variations. The fear wasn't rational. He knew that. But knowing something intellectually doesn't make it any less real, doesn't make it any less powerful. He'd spent his entire life believing he could control outcomes through sheer force of will, through talent and determination and refusal to accept limitations. But he couldn't control this. Couldn't guarantee that if they tried again, the outcome would be different. And the possibility of going through that loss again, of watching Mayte endure that pain again, was more than he could bear. Mayte asked the question that had been building since the conversation started. The one question that would determine whether their marriage had any chance of survival. If he couldn't try again, if he couldn't move forward, if he needed to stay frozen in this moment indefinitely, then what were they doing? What was the point of staying married if they needed fundamentally incompatible things to heal? She wasn't saying she wanted to leave. She clarified quickly, her voice desperate now, tears finally starting to fall despite her best efforts to maintain composure. She loved him. Still loved him. Probably would always love him. But she was 23 years old, and she couldn't spend the rest of her life waiting for him to be ready for something he might never be ready for. She needed to know. Was there any scenario where he could imagine trying again? Any timeline? Any possibility at all? Or was this it? Was this where their story ended, with both of them trapped in grief that was pulling them in opposite directions? Prince didn't answer immediately, and in that silence, Mayte understood everything she needed to know. He couldn't promise her what she needed, couldn't guarantee a future that included the family she dreamed of, couldn't even say with certainty that he'd ever be ready to try again. The fear was too big, too consuming, too fundamental to who he'd become in the year since boy Gregory's death. And in that moment, sitting across from each other in a dimly lit Italian restaurant while strangers accidentally eavesdropped on the collapse of their marriage, they both understood that love wasn't going to be enough to bridge this gap. That sometimes two people could love each other desperately and still be fundamentally incompatible in how they processed trauma. That grief doesn't always bring couples closer together. Sometimes it reveals fault lines that were always there, waiting for enough pressure to finally crack everything open. The conversation eventually ended, not with resolution, but with exhaustion. Both of them too emotionally drained to continue fighting about something that had no solution. They finished their meal in silence, paid the bill, and left through the kitchen entrance, disappearing into the cold Minneapolis night. The couple 2 booths away never knew who they'd just seen. In the months that followed that November evening, Prince and Mayte's marriage continued its slow, inevitable collapse. They stayed together for appearance's sake, continued living at Paisley Park, continued presenting a united front to the outside world. But inside that enormous compound, they were essentially living separate lives, occupying different wings, communicating through staff members, avoiding the conversations that needed to happen because they'd already had that conversation in the restaurant, and knew there was no compromise position that would satisfy both their needs. Mayte got pregnant again in early 1997. A brief moment of hope that maybe things would be different this time. Maybe fate would give them a second chance. But she miscarried a few months later, and that second loss confirmed what both of them had feared. They weren't going to have the family she'd dreamed of, and Prince wasn't going to be able to move past the fear that had been controlling him since October 1996. The divorce came in 1999, quiet and handled through lawyers, stripped of the drama that often accompanies the end of celebrity marriages. Prince had the marriage annulled by the Catholic Church a year later, as if erasing the legal and religious record could somehow erase the pain, the loss, the memory of those conversations where they'd tried desperately to save something that was already beyond saving. They didn't speak for years after the divorce, the distance between them growing until it seemed impossible that they'd once been so close, so intertwined, so convinced they'd found something that would last forever. The public never knew about the restaurant conversation, never understood exactly what had driven them apart. Tabloids speculated about infidelity, about control issues, about the age difference and cultural incompatibility. But the real reason was simpler and more tragic. They'd lost a child, and they couldn't figure out how to survive that loss together. Years later, after Prince's death in 2016, Mayte finally told her side of the story in a book that revealed many of the private moments the public had never known about. She wrote about boy Gregory's birth and death, about the miscarriage, about the silence that had destroyed their marriage, but she didn't write about the restaurant conversation in November 1997, about the moment when they'd both finally acknowledged out loud what they'd been avoiding for months, that they needed incompatible things to heal, and love wasn't going to be enough to bridge that gap. That conversation remained private, known only to them and the strangers who'd accidentally overheard fragments, pieces of a story that explained everything about why sometimes the deepest love isn't enough to survive the cruelest tragedies. The lesson in Prince and Mayte's story isn't about love failing or relationships being fragile. It's about how trauma affects people differently, how grief can pull couples in opposite directions, how two people can desperately want to save their relationship and still find themselves unable to give each other what they need to heal. Mayte needed to move forward, to try again, to refuse to let tragedy define her entire future. Prince needed to stop time, to protect himself from ever experiencing that kind of loss again, to maintain control over a situation that had proven he could never truly control anything. Neither of them was wrong. Neither of them was being unreasonable. They were just two people trying to survive unbearable pain in fundamentally incompatible ways. The conversation that followed, overheard in fragments by strangers, revealed the truth that neither of them could admit publicly for years. Sometimes, the deepest connections break, not because people stop caring, but because they care so much that their grief becomes impossible to share. Because they need such fundamentally different things to heal that staying together means one of them has to sacrifice their survival for the other's comfort. Prince and Mayte's story is ultimately about the limits of love in the face of overwhelming tragedy, about how grief can transform even the strongest relationships into something unrecognizable, about the way trauma reveals incompatibilities that might never have surfaced under normal circumstances. That restaurant conversation wasn't the beginning of their end. It was the moment they both finally acknowledged what had been true since October 1996. They were drowning in different oceans, and neither of them could save the other without sacrificing themselves. Understanding the truth doesn't make it any less tragic, but it does explain why one of music's greatest love stories ended not with scandal or betrayal, but with silence, distance, and the unbearable weight of grief that pulled them in opposite directions until the space between them became too wide to cross.